Hello and welcome back everyone to SciAccess 2020, the Virtual Science Accessibility Conference. For those of you who are just joining us for the first time, my name is Anna Volker and I am your SciAccess Conference Director and the Coordinator of Outreach here at The Ohio State University Department of Astronomy. As I mentioned in the morning session, we have over 1,000 people signed up for today's event and I'm so excited to continue our conversation. Many thanks to all of the wonderful speakers from this morning's session, and I'm really looking forward to getting into the new series of speakers we have for this afternoon. As a reminder, if you are new, if you're just joining for the first time, please use the Q&A function to submit any questions as we go. We'll try to answer them either through text, by typing our responses, or by answering them out loud live on the program. With that, I'd like to welcome our first afternoon speaker. Her name is Amanda Quirk, and she is an astrophysicist PhD candidate and disability advocate. Welcome, Amanda.
Hi everyone, and hi Anna. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Amanda Quirk and I'm a rising fourth year graduate student in the Astronomy and Astrophysics department at UC Santa Cruz. My pronouns are she, her. I am wearing a shirt with black polka dots. I have brown curly hair. I'm a Caucasian woman, and today for the first time in a long time, I'm wearing a little bit of makeup. And I'm gonna share my screen so you all can see my slides. Okay. Today I'm going to be talking to you all about using the principles of universal design to make department activities more physically accessible. Just to give you a little roadmap of where we're going, I'm going to briefly introduce universal design to make sure we're all on the same page. Then I'm going to highlight some of my own experiences of barriers that I have faced. And then I'm going to more broadly introduce some questions you can use to begin to evaluate your department's activities for physical accessibility. I want to acknowledge that I am speaking through the lens of my own lived experience, so I'm only going to be talking about physical accessibility. My personal disability comes with chronic pain and mobility limitations. But planning to be fully accessible for neurodiversity is equally important. Universal design should be applied much more widely than I'm going to be speaking about today. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge intersectionality. Intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it is the framework that the overlap of various social identities contributes to the specific type of systemic oppression and discrimination experienced by an individual. So for example, I am disabled and a woman, so my healthcare needs and pain are often questioned. However, I am also white, so I am not seen as violent or as a threat to police. If you have social media, I really suggest that you follow the hashtag Black Disabled Lives Matter. I've been learning a lot from it and would like to share some of those facts with you today. 30 to 50% of Black people killed by the police have a disability. Black and Latinx children with developmental delays are 78% less likely to receive early support. Black disabled students are twice as likely to be disciplined than white disabled students. Racism is a trigger for poor mental health, and majority Black communities have less access to healthcare. This last fact has been highlighted in the pandemic, but it is certainly nothing new. And I think it's important for all of us, especially white folks, to keep these facts in the front of our mind as we plan to be more accessible. And so today, while I am going to be talking about department activities, you can't forget the physical space in which these activities take place. I want you to all take a moment to imagine or picture the building that your department or institution exists in. Are there wide, even floors? Are there elevators? Was your building built before the ADA, which was just in 1990? For me personally, I attend the beautiful campus of UC Santa Cruz, but it was built way before the ADA in a forest on top of a mountain. So you might be able to imagine that it's not a very accessible campus. And it's very frustrating to go through the bureaucratic channels to make any permanent physical change. And while it's really important to keep up those campaigns, I want to give you all some quick actions that you can do to increase accessibility of your physical space. First, give people the tools they need. Make it a routine to check for ergonomic furniture and have a supply of equipment to teaching available. Ask for accessibility needs when assigning office space. This could include asking what floor an individual needs to be on or their proximity to an elevator. Clearly mark accessible routes inside and outside of a building. Send notifications in advance when construction will block a path. You need to give individuals to figure out how they're going to change their routine if needed. Have a clear protocol of how to report broken elevators. Help finance parking permits for individuals with handicap placards. Often when an institution charges for parking, having a handicap placard does not mean you can park for free. So now there's an additional financial burden on that individual. And additionally, check that the building has enough spaces and that individuals aren't having trouble finding places to park. So these are important steps because many buildings are not designed with accessibility in mind. And that's really where universal design comes in. So this is a concept that was developed in architecture, and it's the idea that something should be planned to be accessible from the very beginning, instead of having accessibility as an afterthought. One example of this is a curb cut. A curb cut is a built-in dip in a curb that allows for smooth access from the sidewalk to the street and vice versa. It doesn't require stepping up or down off a curb. And this is critical for wheelchair users to be able to safely leave the street. But it's of course not limited to wheelchair users. Someone who has a trolley with heavy packages on it or someone pushing a stroller can also have easy access to a sidewalk. When a curb cut doesn't exist, a temporary ramp must be placed there or a curb must be retrofitted to have a ramp. And while this is important, it's not the goal. We don't want to have to retrofit things to be accessible. We want them to be accessible from the beginning. Universal design is really a framework or a mentality or even a goal that we're working towards. I'm going to take a moment to explore this idea further using a graphic that is often used to describe the difference between equality and equity. In the left panel of this graphic, there are 3 individuals. Each are standing on one wooden box. In front of them is a fence that you can't see through, and behind the fence is a soccer game. The individuals are of all different heights, so not all of them can see the game if they are sighted. And in this scenario, everyone's ability is assumed to be equal. In the right panel, the individuals are given a number of boxes based on their height and what they need to be able to see over the fence. In this scenario, individuals are given needed accommodations. I want to make it very clear that accommodations are important. I'm not trying to advocate that we get rid of accommodations. However, with universal design, we can lower the need for accommodations. So for example, in this scenario, instead of building a wooden fence, the park could have been built with a chain link fence, so it has holes in it, and individuals then don't have a height requirement in order to see what is behind the fence. So we want to plan to be as accessible as possible and to remove barriers from the very beginning. This mentality has become popular in education, called universal design for learning. And it's about creating clear and efficient paths for students. So you want to start with the learning goal, or what you hope a student gets out of a lesson or a lecture. Then you create an exhaustive list of all of the skills that students will need to accomplish that goal. Once you have that list, you want to do a check to see if any of these skills present barriers or tasks that are not relevant to the goal. When you're doing this barrier check, you definitely want to keep disability in mind. However, don't limit yourself to barriers that have to do only with disability. For example, if you require your class to use an expensive online homework platform, you might be creating a financial burden for a student who then wouldn't be able to show that they have mastered the material. So once you do a check for barriers and remove any that you see, You then start your curriculum and lesson planning. Once you have your plan, you teach. And then it's a very important step to ask for feedback. Ask if there were any unforeseen barriers that you can remove the next time you teach. And when you ask for feedback, it's important that you ask everyone. If you target the students you think are disabled, you risk othering them. You're also going to miss a lot of students with invisible disabilities, and you're not giving yourself an opportunity to see how universal design also benefited able-bodied and neurotypical individuals. Once you have that feedback, you want to incorporate it, edit your plans before you teach again. Something really important to remember is universal design for learning and universal design in general is not about lowering standards. It's just about creating clearer and more efficient paths to a goal. So I want to take this same mentality and use it to evaluate department activities and incorporate universal design into any changes that you make. So I've come up with 3 guidelines to do this. First, make clear and conscious plans with accessibility in mind. Second, make those plans known. It's important to give individuals time so they can figure out how they are going to tackle a requirement, and also for them to evaluate if they're going to need additional accommodations. And lastly, have multiple pathways for individuals to be motivated, to engage, and to express their success. For the next 3 slides, I'm going to focus on this last guideline. Have multiple pathways along 3 axes, and these axes are representation and motivation, engagement, and action and expression. And to help better explain what I mean by these, I'm going to go through each one at a time and talk about a barrier that I personally have encountered, and how if universal design had been applied before I encountered the barrier, I might not have encountered it at all. So to start with, representation and motivation. What I mean by this is you want to demonstrate to individuals that they are welcome in a field or department and that they can succeed there. One way to do this is to talk about accomplishments of people other than white, able-bodied, and neurotypical men. So for example, last year I attended a conference called Inclusive Astronomy 2. And there I learned about zonification programs created by Dr. Wanda Diaz-Merced. Dr. Wanda Diaz-Merced has been mentioned a couple times today, but just in case you missed the morning session, she is a blind astronomer who has created zonification programs. These programs represent different properties of data with tones. And so not only have these programs allowed her to conduct really amazing research, but they also have been used by both sighted and non-sighted astronomers. And it's become clear that representing properties by tones or sounds often reveals trends that were hidden when you only looked at data visually. And this was the first time in my life I had ever heard about a disabled astronomer. And it was really motivating for me to see that I could also succeed in this field. So an easy solution and universal design incorporation here is highlight disabled scientists and their work. And this is also a great time to recognize intersectionality and talk about astronomers or scientists from other backgrounds to motivate students and individuals with different identities. Moving on to the axis of engagement. With engagement, we want to give all individuals a chance to fully participate. This often means that there needs to be multiple and equally accepted ways to participate. The equally accepted part is very important. You don't want to have any stigmas attached to accessible options. You also don't want to have any kind of hierarchy to the options. Don't make the accessible options be the clear alternates. So for example, UC Santa Cruz has a weekly colloquium, and graduate students sign up to have lunch with the speaker. And lunch is held at a restaurant that is separate from the astronomy building. I've included a screenshot of the Google Maps path on my slide. Google Maps says that it's a 4-minute walk from the astronomy building to the restaurant. But what the screenshot doesn't show is that this path is up a fairly steep hill and requires going up 2 flights of stairs. For me personally, this is a route that I can do, but if I'm having a bad chronic pain day, it could be the difference of me being able to sleep well at night or not. So I just want to pause there and highlight the fact that just because something is possible does not mean it's accessible. So the solution that my department and I came up with together is that graduate students who sign up for lunch and the speaker are asked ahead of time if they would like to have lunch catered in the astronomy building or go to the restaurant with the path described. And if anyone chooses the option to stay in the astronomy building, then that is the one that's done. And lastly, the axis of action and expression. Here you want to give all individuals a chance to show their success. This requires close examination of a task's or requirement's goal. Think back to what I said about universal design for learning. Allow individuals to show their success in ways that might differ from the traditional path. So for example, my first quarter of graduate school, I was given a TA-ship. And I was very excited about this because I care a lot about education and I want to be an educator once I graduate. So the day before I had to teach, I went to find the classroom to make sure I knew where it was the next day. And as I was standing in the classroom, I realized that I was only going to be able to access the bottom half, or really the bottom third of the chalkboard. And therefore that the lesson plans I had made were not going to be very effective. And you might have thought that someone who has been in my body my entire life, that I would have foreseen this as an issue. But I had never taught before, and I had also only ever seen the model of someone teaching at a chalkboard, and I thought that that's how I could be the most effective educator. So luckily, what I also noticed about the room is they had a document projector. So this is a device where you can put anything on its surface and it projects it onto a screen for the class to see. So I bought a small whiteboard and I placed it on the document projector, and that's how I did math in real time or drew diagrams in real time. But this solution required a lot of scrambling on my part and required me to spend a little bit of money. But if I had seen multiple ways of teaching, I might not have encountered this barrier. So of course, those three experiences and my entire experience are way too limited to plan to be fully accessible, even if we're just talking in the physical realm. So to help you all begin to evaluate your department, I'm going to show some basic questions in the next 4 slides. These questions are meant to help you take stock of your department's current accessibility. If you answer no to a question, you now have an easy action item for your department. But remember, these questions are also the bare minimum to be physically accessible. So just because you answer yes doesn't mean you're done. The next step is to incorporate universal design and to create multiple pathways in all aspects of your department. And remember the axes that we talked about previously. But I also want to acknowledge that this might require a lot of work at the beginning and seem overwhelming. However, I ask you all to remember that universal design 100% will benefit everyone in your institution and department. That's something I feel very confident saying. It's crucial for people with disabilities though, so there is some kind of critical push to do this as soon as possible. It also lowers but doesn't eliminate the need for accommodations later. I also understand that there might be some resistance to changing traditions. And whenever you face that resistance, I recommend that you focus on what the heart of these traditions are and create accessible ways and multiple pathways to access that heart. So I'm going to divide these questions into 3 realms: department activities, conferences, and department culture. And by no means is this list of questions exhaustive. But to start with department activities. Are talks and events held in accessible places? Remember that we can't forget the space in which our activities take place in. And are these places close to office space? If they're not close to office space, you need to make sure you're giving individuals enough time to move locations. Are lab spaces and telescopes rooms actually accessible? These spaces are probably the ones that least cared about accessibility when they were being designed and built, but they're often the spaces we have outreach events. And if you have a young student in a room where they see they can't easily exist, it's going to tell them that they are not likely to succeed in a field. And of course, that's not what we want. If events are held off campus, are they checked for accessibility? Is there enough parking? Are there stairs, etc.? We, and I include myself in this, often think that public spaces and public buildings are physically accessible because of the ADA, but that is often not the case, and as said earlier, the ADA is the bare minimum. So it is your responsibility to check a space on your own. For activities that usually require changing buildings, do you have an accessible alternative that is clear, well-known, and supported? Remember my colloquium lunch example. I also want to note that for visitors, it can be very stressful if you have them change multiple buildings throughout the day. So it can help lower stress and anxiety too if you minimize the number of buildings that you operate in. Our department talks streamed and recorded. Our speakers given a microphone. Having talks streamed and recorded gives flexibility. So this allows someone who is disabled to honor what their body needs and maybe work from the couch one day. Additionally, it allows someone who is traveling or whose childcare maybe fell through that day to still access the information in a talk, even if they can't be physically present. Of course, for the people who are physically present, having a speaker use a microphone is important for the audience to be able to hear what they're saying, but it's also critical that audio shows up on any streams or recordings. And lastly, when preparing for talks or making signs for the department, do you check for color blindness? I use a free app called Color Oracle. It sits in your menu bar on your computer, and at any time you can click it and it will simulate what color blindness looks like. Moving on to conferences. Can people participate remotely? I think this horrible pandemic has taught us that the answer is yes. And while I'm not advocating that we no longer have in-person conferences, I am advocating for there always to be a remote participation option. Again, this allows someone with a disability to honor their body, but it also allows someone who has dependents at home or who is not sure how they will finance attending a conference to still be able to participate. Do you ask participants for access needs, and do you take full responsibility of fulfilling them? It's important that you do both, ask for needs and then take on any responsibility, including any potential financial responsibilities of making sure those needs are fully met. Our talk streamed and recorded, our speakers given a microphone, our ASL translators provided. And lastly, are there equally valid, accessible break activities? I don't know about other STEM fields, but for some reason, astronomers love to have hikes be a conference activity. And hikes are obviously not usually physically accessible. And I also personally know able-bodied astronomers who do not like hiking. But the heart of this activity is to try to leave the space in which work is happening and to create a casual environment to network and to ask follow-up questions. And I have no doubt that the heart of this activity can be accomplished without taking a hike. And lastly, the realm of department culture. Does your department place work over one's physical health? Do people brag about having never taken a sick day or pushing through illness? This is simply not healthy for anyone, but for someone with a disability, this might not be even an option for them, and therefore they can be labeled as not hardworking or not caring enough, and that's not ideal, of course. Does your department have a relationship with your campus's Disability Resource Center? We aren't often trained in how to be accessible or incorporate universal design, but there are experts on our campuses. The Disability Resource Center has many solutions for how to be more accessible. They're also there for you to brainstorm with when you come up with an accessibility need that you aren't sure how to accomplish. And these centers are often targeted at undergraduate students, so it's important to remind graduate students and faculty and staff that they have access to it. Do you ask for any accessibility needs when you correspond with visitors? Visitors include speakers, job applicants, and prospective graduate students. Just to lightly threaten you all, I can say it is very embarrassing for a department when a visitor comes and it's clear that they can't participate in the planned activities. It does not make your department seem welcoming, and it's also something people talk about. When you talk about equity, inclusion, and diversity, do you include the axis of disability? Do you use ableist sayings or co-opt disability identity language? So for example, the Hubble Space Telescope just came up with a double anonymous proposal system. So to try to move away from the gender bias when selecting proposals, which of course is good, but many astronomers, instead of saying double anonymous, are saying double blind proposals. And what we mean to say is that information is purposefully obscured, and that's not what blind means. And lastly, when an accessibility concern is brought to your attention, do you make a one-time change in accommodation, or do you make a permanent change? Making that permanent change is what universal design is, and that's what I really encourage you all to do. I also want to acknowledge that you will never be fully prepared, and that that's okay. You cannot foresee every accessibility need. The range of of disability is very wide. You also will not perfectly plan for those needs that you do foresee, and that's because accessibility needs are very individualized. So if someone comes to you with an accommodation, you haven't failed. You just need to listen to them. And in order to create a safe environment for someone to feel comfortable coming to you with their accessibility need, you need to be flexible with all of your policies. I really encourage that you examine your attendance policies and any requirements of standardized tests like the GRE. Of course, don't further stigmas. Also, mirror someone's language when you're talking to them. People have chosen the words that they want to use to describe themselves and their disability, and it's important you respect that. Also, make it clear that the department will work to make sure everyone can succeed, regardless of ability. Say that multiple times a year and make it true. And of course, ask for, accept, and incorporate feedback from everyone. I also want to advocate for creating space for disability. In my personal experience, disability community groups are difficult to find at the institutions that I personally have attended. Begin making space for disability by normalizing talking about it in your department. Just talking about it is a really important first step. And if you have the opportunity, promote the creation and growth of disability community groups in your department or on campus. It's okay if you don't feel qualified to lead or start a group, but you can still allocate space or funding for that group. And you can also support groups that do exist. So I'm going to end by tying this back to intersectionality in the Black Disabled Lives Matter movement and share some resources with you all. I'm going to send my slides to Anna, so you will have the links to all of these resources, but to quickly go through them, there's a website called blackdisabledandproud.org that has resources for college students. They also have some readings on the intersection of race, disability, and education. Autismandrace.com also has some reading. And then just a few examples of groups are the National Black Disability Coalition, the National Alliance of Multicultural Disabled Advocates, and the Black Disability Collective. And just a few examples of some activists to follow and listen to: Amani Barberin, Melissa Thompson, Carrie Gray, Jen White Johnson, and Kay. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to answer questions if we have time to do that.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was fantastic. We do have a few minutes left to answer questions. We've got about 10 minutes before our next speaker is scheduled. So if you have questions for Amanda, go ahead and submit them now. I do see one here for you in the chat from Jake, who mentions that we have a horribly inaccessible observatory in the Netherlands, so there's no ADA, though the building was opened in 2008. What do we do? Recently, we have operated it for our students via Zoom for their observational astronomy class. Is there a route that we should go down? For example, providing outreach events also in Zoom? Any other ideas for us?
Yeah, so those are some great ideas. I would say very generally reach out to the disability community system. So or disability community. I am not an expert in this. Participating via Zoom is great. Also trying to make actual construction changes. So retrofitting your observatory to be accessible. I can say that this is not just a problem that is unique to the Netherlands. I don't think I have ever been in a telescope or room or an observatory that is accessible. And just because there's no ADA or they were built a long time ago does not give them an excuse to not make the necessary changes. So I would recommend construction. I like the idea of having Zoom outreach events, but also reaching out to any local disability community groups and letting them be the experts to guide you through what needs to change. And of course, pay them for the time and the effort that they go through.
Thank you so much. I do see we have some hands raised, so I'm going to go ahead and call on Haley Thurston, who I have now given microphone access. Haley, if you're there, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question aloud.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
I just wanted to say that you are awesome. You both are awesome. But you know, the speech that you made, I have been in my town getting some accessibility in restaurants, and I noticed that some restaurants nowadays are even making their menus online, but the websites are not accessible.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's great that you're making your menus online, but I have to call another person to access that website, and it's not good. So
Totally.
I mean, what answers do you have? I mean, should I call the restaurant and say, hey, your website is not accessible? I mean, what?
Yeah, so that sounds really frustrating. And I think something that is highlighted for any oppressed group is that the effort usually falls on those who are oppressed to advocate for themselves. So it's frustrating that as you're experiencing this, you might be the one who have to point out to the restaurant that they have tried to make it accessible, but they have failed in certain ways. And I think you have also brought up a point that online accessibility is really important too. And there are tons of resources out there. Yeah, so I don't think I have a better answer for you other than if you feel like you have the emotional labor to point this out to the restaurant, or if you have an able-bodied friend who has maybe more emotional labor in this sense and can point it out to them.
Yeah. Because it's a lovely restaurant, but I want to check out the menu and see what they have. And as a blind person, it's just like, okay, why is this website inaccessible? Like, they do have a menu that is actually accessible for me. So why is the website not accessible? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I like to hope to believe in the goodness of people that they just really aren't aware. And that's not a great excuse, but if they have tried to make a menu accessible, that gives me hope that they're open to the idea that they have not fully accomplished their goal.
Exactly.
Thank you. Thank you, Haley, so much. I appreciate your comment and your question. Thank you. We do have another hand raised here, so I'm going to go ahead and call on Renee Windish. Renee, if you are there, I have just granted you microphone access, so if you're with us, Renee, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello. Can you hear me? Is that
Yes,
Yes.
it's working.
Okay, sorry. I'm just wondering, when you talk about some of those inclusive things, I think about students that I support in the social aspect on campus.
Okay.
And we have a Center for Diversity and Inclusion, and the intention, I mean, we even have like a prayer room and a breastfeeding room and all of these wonderful spaces, without directly targeting one people group or one social group, would you say? So would you say that that would be the route to continue to include students with disabilities as well, versus having kind of our own separate entity? Because we do want that inclusive model. At the same time, some students are not eager to be like, oh, I'm X, this person, and this is my disability, right? Like we recognize that as well, but it also includes some of our veterans too. So it's kind of a, I mean, the idea is to be a safe space for everyone, obviously, but.
Yeah, and I think that's a tricky question because everybody has different levels of comfort with identifying as disabled. I know that personally, that was not something that I could say until I was in college because the stigma around disability is so strong. So I think maybe if you can try to do both, create a space that does name disability as the community unifier, but also make sure that these other spaces like the prayer room or the breastfeeding room are as accessible as possible so that naturally students with disabilities can exist in these spaces.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We only have about 2 more minutes here, Amanda, and I see there's so many awesome questions for you. So I know we won't get to them all, and I just wanted to let everyone know that Amanda actually will be hosting one of the social chats. So if you have more specific questions to continue the conversation with Amanda, she will be hosting one of the social rooms. So I'm going to share that. Thank you so much, Renee, for your question. We'll go ahead and take one more here. A quick technical thing we can resolve. One of their users asks if it's okay to share screenshots from your PowerPoint, Amanda, to share publicly a screenshot, specifically the starting questions for accessibility checks.
Yes, I am going to share the slides with Anna too, and I'm happy to have these slides used as widely as possible. That's my goal, that you actually use these questions, so I would be grateful if you did use them.
Thank you so much. And I will say, as a quick shout out, I see here this question asker, Emily Calandrelli, is an award-winning TV host and is a consultant on Bill Nye's TV show and is an incredible science communicator. So that's certainly a wonderful person to be helping share your resources. So I'm excited to see that she's in our audience today. Awesome. So we'll go ahead and do one final question here, and then the rest, Amanda, feel free to answer via typing or to continue the conversation in your social room. I'm just going to scroll here through here for a moment and pick one out for us to go over. So I'm going to go with Judy, who says, "Great talk, Amanda. How can we push back against resistance from our departments about the cost of making spaces accessible?"
Yeah, so unfortunately, I definitely understand that pushback. And I think this is where we shouldn't shy into being polite. I think we need to acknowledge the reality that if you do not make those changes, people with disabilities will not come to your institution. That sounds like a threat, but it's also true. If you're not taking on the burden, you are purposefully choosing to not be accessible and to not create a space where people with disabilities can exist.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time and for that wonderful talk. That was really fantastic.